Hello and welcome to Lamestream, a show that guides you through the crisis in media and how it's impacting everything. I'm Osman Faruqi. I'm here with my co-host Scott Mitchell. Scott, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Oz. How are you doing? What's news?
Well, I'm good. I'm good, Scott. There's some pretty funny news that I saw this morning out of the US. It's a merger of like two things that you and I like talking about, the world of Hollywood and the world of politics. It's a very funny story that was first broken by a Hollywood reporter that I know you and I both follow, a guy called Matt Bellany. He said, and it's since been confirmed, that there will be a fourth movie in the Rush Hour franchise, the franchise starring Chris
Ooh,
Tucker and Jackie Chan.
who could
And the
forget?
reason there's going to be a fourth movie in this franchise is because Donald Trump, the president of the United States, really wants it. And he's lent on his mate, David Ellison, who now owns Paramount the studio, to bring it back. I mean, this is one of the weirdest stories. And I say that fully aware that there are a lot of weird news stories that we are living through right now. What do you make of this? You a Rush Hour head? You excited about Rush Hour 4? Why does Trump like Rush Hour? What's going on here?
I mean, I liked Rush Hour at the time. I love Jackie Chan. Shout out Jackie. Hope that he gets that check.
Good Canberra boy?
Yeah, Canberra boy. I have to say though, this has to be completely unsurprising that this is one of Trump's favorite movies, doesn't it, Oz? Like the entire thing is basically a black guy making fun of a Chinese guy for being Chinese, and the Chinese guy making fun of the black guy for being black. No wonder Trump loves this movie.
The kind of maybe strangest thing about this, and maybe the most problematic thing about it, is the movies were directed by this guy Brett Ratner,
Ah,
who since the
yes.
movies came out has been accused of sexual harassment by numerous women, kind of killed his Hollywood career. In fact, in 2023 he moved to Israel and has become like quite close to Benjamin Netanyahu. So I don't know whether there's like some kind of Trump Ratner connection that is like helping this guy kind of come out of the woodwork. It will be Brett Ratner who is directing this fourth movie. As far as I'm aware, like Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker haven't said anything. I don't know how they necessarily feel about being brought into this kind of like strange Trumpian Hollywood decision making process. There's also another political side to this. Like I
Well,
mentioned
can I
that.
just? I mean, I'm sure Jackie and Chris would love to get the band back together. Brett Ratner, also obviously a huge Australian connection. Oz, the producing partner of James Packer, and the man who introduced James Packer to Mariah Carey in one of the most fascinating romantic engagements of, I would say, the millennium.
Yeah, and there is an Israel connection there as well, believe it or not. When Packer lived in Israel and Mariah Carey concerts to tickets to Mariah Carey concerts was sort of part of some attempt to, curry favor with Netanyahu. I believe the name of their production company is Rat Pack, Ratner and Packer. So yeah, there are so many weird and wacky connections to this Rush Hour story. And one of the weirdest, and I think like perhaps most distressing for me, for people who really have been following the ins and outs of the Hollywood business lately. Like we've discussed David Ellison on this show a few times before, his purchase of Paramount, what that means for Hollywood studios, but also for things like Channel 10 in Australia. In terms of like why he might decide to greenlight Rush Hour 4 to satisfy Donald Trump, well, now the Ellisons are trying to buy another Hollywood studio, Warner Brothers. And to be able to do that, because of the fact that they already own Paramount, they will need support from Donald Trump's government. So is this like yet another potential media quid pro quo? Are we going to see two of the oldest and most storied studios in Hollywood history merge, which is going to be very, very bad for artists, actors, directors, and for punters to have like less competition, to have one billionaire own everything, to have less good, interesting films made? Are we going to see all of that, Scott, just because Donald Trump wants Rush Hour 4? Honestly, the answer to that seems to be yes. This is crazy stuff.
Incredible, incredible.
I want to ask you a question, Scott. If you were Donald Trump and if David Ellison was saying, hey, I want to merge my studios together, will you let that happen? And you had to say, only if you greenlight this film. I need a sequel. I need you to reboot this. What are you choosing here?
Oh my God. Oz, the power at my fingertips to get a sequel to any film I wanted. To have David Ellison over a barrel and demand any sequel. There are so many. I mean, first of all, the unproduced Nick Cave Gladiator 2 script, that would 1,000% be in, for those who
That's a
don't
good one.
know.
It's a good one.
When unproduced, I don't even know if Ridley Scott or the studio knew Nick Cave was writing it, but Russell asked him to. It ends with Russell Crowe's character in Gladiator being stuck in an endless, immortal life of fighting every war in history and sort of morally degrading himself until he's forced to fight in Iraq for America, or at least be involved somehow in that. The Nice Guys, another Russell film, Justice for the Nice Guys. I'd also like to see a sequel. I've long wanted a sequel to The Last Samurai. What does Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Algren do after the fall of Ken Watanabe's final samurai warriors? Where does he go? What happens to Daniel Algren?
That is awesome. I love the idea of you in the White House just in between trying to present a peace plan to Russia and Ukraine, also being like, look, we need The Last Samurai 2. Last two samurai. Let's go. I believe it's a very genuine answer from you, and now I kind of want that film as well. David Ellison, if you're listening,
it's a great film.
Give us The Last Samurai 2. Yeah.
What would you do? What would you do? Come on, you've got to give me one.
Well, if we're talking specifically about bringing back like slightly problematic like characters who have been a bit brushed aside from Hollywood, I have a real soft spot for the first Transformers movie. Michael Bay,
yeah,
Shia LaBeouf, Megan Fox. And I know that they did like 7 more of those movies.
Yeah, why do we need a sequel to those?
Well, I think Scott, I think there was only one sequel. I think it was the second one, Revenge of the Fallen, that maintained the Shia, Megan Fox kind of romantic kind of pairing. And then I think we went off into different worlds. Let's
Sorry. You thought
bring back Rush Hour 4. I can't get Shia LaBeouf and Megan Fox in another Transformers movie.
You thought that the natural chemistry between Shia LaBeouf and Megan Fox was so like capturing genie in a bottle, such a iconic romantic duo. That chemistry was so sizzling we needed more than 2 movies of it.
I'm not joking. I think that first movie in particular is an underrated gem. If we're returning to fucking Rush Hour, like Jackie and Chris have got to be like, what, in their 60s now? If we can do that,
sure.
I feel like either The Last Samurai or Transformers should be pretty easy to pull off as well.
I want Jackie back. I mean, he didn't make enough money off the early films, which are incredible. I think he should get some checks. I hope Rush Hour 4 happens.
It's a good way to wrap up that part of the conversation. Should we get into the episode proper, you reckon?
Absolutely. I think it's about time.
12 minutes on Rush Hour 4. All right, today on the show, Australian politics plumbed some new depths this week with Pauline Hanson deciding to hijack Parliament by wearing a burqa. It led to a censure in the Senate, but also guaranteed days of coverage, which is, I guess, what she was hoping for. We'll take a look at everything that happened in Parliament around Hanson's stunt, the fallout, and how One Nation's attempts to lure Barnaby Joyce to the party are going. Later in the show, we'll look at the Australian newspaper that has launched a campaign targeting Australia's funding of, quote, evil regimes that commit war crimes, after spending 2 years criticizing all of us who begged for the reality of Israel's genocide to be reported accurately.
Plus, in keeping tabs, a new editor has been appointed at the Sydney Morning Herald after Bevan Shields resigned this week. We get into what it means. I'm going to check in on an old friend of the show, Erin Molan. Some exciting developments on Erin. And unfortunately, Oz, your prediction that Australian media would continue to dog Usman Khawaja and focus on his golf game has come true. That has continued to be big news. And if people hang around, they're going to get to hear you unleash on Australian sports media.
And before we get into all of that, Scott, a reminder that you can follow us on Instagram at LameStreamPod. You can watch us on YouTube at LameStream, and you can subscribe to our weekly newsletter to help us make the podcast at lamestream.com.au. And speaking of subscribers, we have a very, very exciting new offer for people who subscribe to support the show. It's an ad-free version of this very podcast. Advertising obviously helps us make the show, and you may start hearing some ads that we are voicing ourselves, which is very fun and I think a much more pleasant experience for everyone. But some people don't like ads. That's fine. And the good news is, if that's you, if you subscribe at lamestream.com.au, you'll get access to the show without ads. So yeah, subscribe, help support the work that we do, and get the podcast in whatever form you prefer. All right, Scott, take us to Canberra this week.
Oh, do I have to? Pauline Hanson has been banned from the Senate for 7 sitting days after she pulled a stunt on Monday wearing a burqa into the Senate chamber. And it's literally a repeat of a stunt that she pulled 8 years ago in 2017. Clearly, Hanson did this for attention. Clearly, she wanted media, and she got it. The photos of her wearing this were everywhere. And I'm aware that we sort of risk falling into that and giving her what she wants, which is attention, but I do think this is the kind of thing we have to discuss. For me, first and foremost, when this story happened, responsibility for Hanson being allowed to get away with this stunt lies with the Senate and with the Labor government. No one is allowed to bring props into the chamber. That's a long-held rule in Parliament, let alone props to perform a stunt as offensive and disgusting as this one. I actually went back and watched the entire session that this happened in Oz. Despite the fact that Hanson has done it before, she managed to do it for so long. I timed it, and from the minute that Hanson entered the chamber in this burqa, she was able to sit there for 25 minutes before she was ejected. This hate-filled clown show went on for 25 minutes, despite the fact she's been ejected before for this. The deputy president of the Senate sat there for the session, going on with business as usual, and actually admonishes Senators Lydia Thorpe, Maureen Faruqi, and Fatima Payman, who were the first to urgently try and get him to eject Hanson. And instead, he sort of ruled that it was okay and to continue going for far too long before the session was finally kind of wrestled under control. The president of the Senate returned and did eject her. Before we get into the rest of it, that just is unacceptable to me, that Hanson was allowed to get the photo opportunity she wanted against Senate rules, and this was even allowed to happen in the first place.
Yeah, I think that is an important point. We're going to talk about it in more detail, but I can think of other minorities in Australia that if Hanson was seeking to mock and disrespect and ridicule by wearing their dress or a version of it designed to antagonize the community, it would not have been allowed to go on for that long, that she would have been ejected much, much quicker. And it wouldn't have been a Indigenous woman and the 2 Muslim women in Parliament who were the ones who had to try their hardest to kind of get action taken. The challenge we're talking about this, Scott, as you've alluded to, it's obviously it's a stunt and it's designed to get everyone to talk about it. But sometimes there's no avoiding it because it did dominate parliamentary proceedings for 2 days. And also because it is significant to have a far-right politician of the stature of Hanson who was achieving a record-high polling result antagonizing a marginalized community in this way. That's just in fact that happened. It exists and it deserves to be scrutinized and discussed, as does the response to it, which I think has been pretty disgraceful from most sides of Parliament. And it seems like the thing that seemed the most absurd to me is that the initial punishment doled out to Hanson for doing this was exactly the same as what was doled out to Greens Deputy Leader Maureen Faruqi. And for any new listeners of the podcast who are unaware, yes, that is my mother. It's my disclosure. What she got for holding up a sign that said "Sanction Israel." That was the same thing where it's we censure you and you're banned from taking part in any overseas delegations. And maybe politicians in the Senate are well, that's just the rule that we've got. But I think to anyone who follows this stuff from the outside, it looks so stupid that those things have been given an equivalence by the Senate. And in fact, the only reason that Hanson was then suspended for 7 days was because she refused to apologize after that censure. And to me, Scott, part of the reason why the political response to this has been so weird. And like the media coverage to this has also been, I think, pretty odd from some quarters. Like a lot of it from mainstream outlets has really tried to paint Hanson as a victim. The Daily Mail headline on this was Pauline Hanson suspended from the Senate in stinging punishment for burqa stunt, and cops pile on from heckling Marine Faruqi and Lydia Thorpe, right? Like that's like the tenor of the Daily Mail, which is like Hanson trying to do her thing and these crazy brown and black women are yelling at her. My take as to why the media can get away with that kind of coverage and why, as you pointed out, the Senate deputy president just fucked around for half an hour before doing anything is because the community Hanson's targeting is the Muslim community, one of the most villainized and targeted and demonized communities in Australia by politicians and by the media.
Yeah, and look, I know that some people get frustrated when we say like the media as a whole. I obviously have heard some, I think, good reporting from whether it's some of the 9 newspapers, some of the ABC, some of The Guardian, that I think treats this as disgraceful as it was. But I think the reason why it's important to highlight, say, the Daily Mail, news.com.au, those are the like Hanson only cares about those photos running to those kind of places where readers will get no context. They'll just see this, she gets attention. Anyway, to move away from Hanson and stop talking about her for a minute and talk about a really serious issue that this raises to me, Oz. Labor. Like, Labor in this, Penny Wong moved the motion to censure Hanson. Labor drafted it. But Labor have a big say in how the Senate runs and what happens in the chamber. They have a share of responsibility for Hanson being able to get away with this. Yet, they were able, in the main, to be covered like they were leading the charge against her here. And let me explain what I mean. Here's Tanya Plibersek talking about it on Wednesday morning.
We saw a bunch of Nazis lined up outside New South Wales Parliament a couple of weeks ago. I don't see Pauline Hanson calling out that behaviour or that risk. She's once again going for a group of people who will be, threatened, abused and perhaps even physically assaulted on their way to work or school today.
Opinion polls show One Nation's immigration stance is taking support away from the Coalition and Labor. Liberal leaders...
Now you listen to that. Good sentiment. Yes, would agree. That is probably the impact of what Hanson's done. It is deplorable. But how do Labor behave on this? Well, Senator Fatima Payman, who is the only woman to wear the hijab ever elected to the Senate, she pointed out that since she left the Labor Party, her office has been inundated with death threats, harassment, racism. She's written to the Labor government numerous times to try and get resources for her staff or additional staff because of the load they've been under reading this awful stuff all day. And she says that it's been taken a huge toll on them. She hasn't even gotten an answer back from the government. So people like Tanya Plibersek can go on about hypothetical women in hijab on public transport and how Labor stands with them. There's literally one in the chamber and Labor is doing nothing to help them. Let alone, Oz, while this censure motion against Hanson was being discussed, the only Muslim senator to speak before the vote was Marine Faruqi. And it was a pretty solemn, serious moment in the Senate talking about the nature of multiculturalism, about this being a really important vote, all this kind of stuff. And Faruqi is yelled over while she's speaking, yes, by coalition senators, but also by Penny Wong, the Labor leader in the Senate. What kind of example is that? If you're taking this so seriously, you're such defenders of multiculturalism, and you have one of the most senior members of the government deciding to interject and talk while the only Muslim speaking before the vote is talking. It is just outrageous. And while I do think this is a story where actually the politicians have the most to answer for here, it was really disturbing to me, Oz, that there has been a lack of interest, I think, from the media in questioning Labor over how they've handled all this. And instead, it's very quickly just fit into the very simple story of Labor censures Hanson on one side and then people who defend Hanson on the other. Simple story, that's the conflict. And no one has seemed really interested in asking Labor questions about whether they're doing enough to oppose racism, whether they are living up to the ideals that they have been talking about this week.
Yeah, I think, Scott, I think what the whole situation confirms is that there are two institutions in Australia that are perhaps the least well equipped to deal with racism and how it manifests. The first is Parliament, and the second is the media. And unfortunately, they happen to be the two most influential institutions on this issue. And I think it's like the only thing I'll quibble with, the only thing that I'll disagree with you on slightly, Scott, is, you make the point that I think is fair. It's like places like the Daily Mail are quite different to how, say, the ABC, the Herald, and the Guardian would cover this story. I don't think I'm trying to draw an equivalence there. But I do think this story and the way it played out and everything you just said is so illuminating about how the issue of race plays out in Parliament and in the Senate, and who is attacked and who's yelled over and all that sort of stuff. You just haven't seen any worthwhile reporting or analysis of that from even those outlets like the ABC, from the Guardian, from the Sydney Morning Herald. And like, it's not even that, like, I mean, firstly, they just don't have non-white or Muslim journalists to cover federal politics, but they don't even need to. Like, you're a white guy and you just did a very good job of summarizing that stuff. It's not just like, I don't want to just make a point about diversity for tokenism's sake, but I just don't see in an Australian media landscape, an Australian political media landscape, journalists who've got experience, knowledge, or understanding of how race exists and manifests in these conversations. And that's a problem when we're talking about Pauline Hanson attacking the Muslim community. It's a problem where race and migration are becoming clear political cleavages in Australia and around the world, to the point where Hanson is growing her vote to this extent. So I think it just kind of highlights a serious expertise gap that exists amongst our media class. In terms of the political response, you mentioned the coalition senators yelling over Marine. I mean, Bridget McKenzie, Matt Canavan, they were interrupting a Muslim senator's speech in her attempt to denounce Hanson, to accuse her, the Muslim senator, of being racist to white people, right? That, beyond being mentioned in the Sydney Morning Herald live blog, has not elicited any kind of analysis or conversation. Like, Bridget McKenzie and Matt Canavan are not fringe players. They are very senior members of the coalition who, instead of forthrightly condemning Hanson, decided to attack the Muslim senator that Hanson was trying to antagonize, or is from the community that Hanson was trying to antagonize. And what really frustrates me, Scott, is when Donald Trump or foreign politicians pull shit like this and talk about like anti-white racism, all these bleeding heart Australians, including journalists, get so worked up and say, this is so toxic. Donald Trump is this crazy character. Like, how's this going on? What's happened to America? It used to be a normal country. This is the daily shit that happens in Australia from politicians that these journalists know, report on, interview, talk, who were in government last time, who will be in government if the coalition gets elected. And there's just like barely any conversation about that. It doesn't elicit any kind of outrage from those serious media players. And I think the other part of the media story that I think was missing in terms of just like important contextual information as to perhaps why Hanson is doing this now, I couldn't find a single story, Scott, on the burqa issue that mentioned that Pauline Hanson lost a racial vilification case against Marine Faruqi and was found in a federal court to have a tendency to make racist, discriminatory, hateful, derogatory, and Islamophobic statements. And she literally is right now, and it was in court last week, back in court appealing that decision. Now, I think that might be some context as to why Hanson has decided to antagonize the Muslim community within the safety of Parliament from like a freedom of speech perspective this week. Just very, very odd that no political journalist thinks that's a relevant part of the Hanson v. Muslim story.
Yeah, and to talk about Hanson a little bit more, I apologize. I want to stop hearing her name too. I'm sick of it. But the thing I want to talk about on her briefly, Oz, is step back and look at her strategy this week and what's going on. It's very clear to me that she returned to Parliament off the back of this rise in the polls and has decided to ramp up the stunts. She is obviously filled with confidence. She wants to capitalize. And, you know, she was scheduled at one point to premiere a full feature-length version of her weird South Park-inspired viral clips that she like posts on Facebook in a screening at Parliament House. That's now been barred by parliamentary officials. But the fact that that even was scheduled and exists is bizarre. And this week, another stunt she pulled was she invited Barnaby Joyce for a steak dinner in her office, and camera crews were there to watch her cook Wagyu steaks on a sandwich press. And that led to one of the most bizarre and ridiculous rounds of media coverage I may have ever seen. Both the Sydney Morning Herald and the Australian unleashed their food sections to write up, like, should you cook steaks on a sandwich press, kind of clickbait articles. I think we know the answer to that, Oz. I think you don't cook Wagyu steaks on a sandwich press. Sure.
Wagyu steaks from Gina Reinhardt's farms, apparently, no less.
Brilliant.
I mean, to be very clear about the timeline on this, the steak dinner with Barnaby Joyce was the night of the burqa stunt, and the soft coverage of it followed afterwards. So, as an example, again, of like just how utterly woeful the kind of political coverage of this is, like, what is the disincentive for Hanson here, where you can go and pull that stunt and, like, you know, risk censure, but that night and in the newspapers, your happy snaps of having steak dinner with Barnaby are splashed in an exclusive in the Sydney Morning Herald with quotes about, like, the conversations you're having? How can she get away with both of those things at the same time? I just can't imagine. Again, like, make an example of, like, the Greens or of Lydia Thorpe, or even of, like, David Pocock trying to do a stunt like this. The media wouldn't buy it. They'd be like, cool, you're trying to talk to a political ally and you're cooking him steak. That's cool. But, like, why should I run that for you exclusively? That's just obviously a stunt. But Hanson keeps being able to get away with this. And as you say, they write, like, the political story exclusively in a way that's, like, flattering to Hanson. And then you get the fluffy lifestyle stories with the Oz and the SMH talking about how she cooked the steaks, using the sandwich press. And look, that is one of the few utensils that politicians have in their small offices in Canberra. And actually, like, not to, like, endorse the stories that they ran, I'm, like, slightly sympathetic to the conundrum of what you eat in Parliament. You know, I used to work in Parliament House. There's late nights. There's not a lot of, like, cooking utensils. I'm a staunch defender of what we call the trough, which is, like, the staff canteen there, because they have proper kitchen and there's only so much you can cook with a microwave and a sandwich press. But look, that's just me talking as a person about my own issues working in Parliament. What the hell are we doing here when it comes to writing about Hanson cooking steaks for Barnaby Joyce, who's a far-right politician who is going to wield enormous power, already does wield enormous power, who could be so influential after the next election? She's just used Parliament to antagonize and villainize the Muslim community, and she gets soft coverage about how she cooked a steak for a guy that she's trying to convince to join her party. This is ridiculous.
I love the idea that this steak to be led by Pauline Hanson. I think he's going to get wooed and then roll her, and this thing could be pretty bad in hindsight. And I want to talk about that serious kind of going forward political element of this, citing someone who is unlikely to ever get a citation again on Lamestream Oz. I happen to listen to George Brandis, the former Liberal Attorney General on ABC Radio. He made the point that after Hanson's burqa stunt in 2017, One Nation polling actually went down after that, and he sort of made the case that he thought that this stunt would actually backfire for Hanson. I do think it's an interesting point that Oz, you know, One Nation's rise in the polls up till now, we've talked about it a lot. I have never thought that that's been driven by anything that Hanson herself or anyone in One Nation has actually done. I think it's driven by much bigger social, economic forces around the globe that are creating fertile ground for far-right ideas. And it is possible that Hanson has overestimated herself here, and that reminding people she is basically all about stunts like this might make people think twice about voting One Nation. There's a pretty revealing moment later in the week when this idea was basically put to her by SBS News' Naveen Razak.
Now, you're polling at 20%. So do you seriously think that 1 in 5 Australians support the position that you want to put forward? And do you think that at this point, you're on the verge of becoming mainstream? Why go back to what many people see as a fringe issue, as opposed to perhaps broadening the agenda to other issues that Australians are clearly talking about, like the cost of living?
Look, I totally agree with you. It is very important to the Australian people, especially with our policies of getting rid of climate change and bringing in an energy policy, which I'll be introducing at the end of the week. So, and the cost of living, totally agree. The farming sector, agriculture, industries, manufacturing, very, very important, high on my agenda, as is family law. National security has been a big issue, and it's also about women's rights.
Oz, I mean, we're going to get rid of climate change? Like, she can barely string a sentence together to that question. Bad signs, I think, about how her political stratagem brain is kind of thinking about this.
She's not the most articulate politician, that's for sure.
No, but then again, I do think there's something to that. Then again, it isn't 2017 anymore. I think racist speech has been more normalized and mainstream. We've gone through this sort of post-woke moment where that stuff isn't necessarily frowned upon and it is more in the public sphere. So maybe it does resonate with Australians more today than it did then. I don't really know. I'll be interested to see, what do you think? Does this week say anything kind of bigger about where politics is heading?
I think it's an important point you make about what's driving the increase in the One Nation vote, because when you listen to that clip, it's obviously not Hanson's commanding presence and her ability to articulate policies that is driving it, right? Like, they haven't announced anything significant that has led to this shift. The fact that they're now sitting somewhere between 15 to 18% of the national vote, leapfrogging the Greens and only 8 to 10 points behind the coalition, that's generally just because a big chunk of Australians are unenthused by the coalition. And as you said, there are these global forces driving conversations around migration and race. And they're like, oh yeah, One Nation's got the racist vibe. I guess that's the party I'll go to.
Yeah.
That's really it. And in terms of whether this particular stunt helps or hinders, I don't think this will help grow their vote. I don't think this is what gets them from 18% to 25%. But I don't think it will cost them anything. And I think as much as good on Brandis for being this could backfire, I think that is some wishful thinking from centristy, small L liberal types in Australia. As again, you pointed out, it's a very different world now to 2017. There doesn't seem to be political punishment for attacking minorities in this way. And in fact, there seems to be an enormous amount of political rewards all over the world, including in Western democracies, right? And there is this idea that in Australia, if you attack a marginalized community, the people don't reward you. Where is the example of that?
Yeah.
Where is the example that being racist and piling on Muslims costs you votes in Australia? And to me, there is no evidence of that. The Guardian's political editor, Tom McElroy, wrote about this after the stunt. He said, voters don't want religious or racial division in their national parliament. And firstly, I just don't know what the evidence is for that, And then secondly, he went on to say, while banning the burqa might play with Sky After Dark audiences, it is miles from a mainstream concern among punters. That, I think, is true, but I think Hanson's main strategy right now is just to be talked about as much as possible while the coalition is in disarray. So I don't think that it will backfire the way that some of these pundits seem to think it will. And Scott, funnily enough, just on that McElroy piece, I saw Paul Karp, who is formerly The Guardian's chief political correspondent, who left as part of a big exodus at the Bureau earlier this year where McElroy was brought in. He had a bit of a dig at McElroy on Blue Sky for claiming, sort of making fun of him for seemingly trying to argue that Hanson was trying to make a genuine case to ban the burqa. That stood out to me because it's always fun to see a bit of industry beef, which normally is behind closed doors, play out publicly on social media.
Journalists are so funny, aren't they? Who hasn't left a job and then kind of gone, had a feeling of, oh, I did it better in my day, and then everyone's felt
my
that way.
take would have been better.
Yeah, my take would have been better. That's everyone's instinct leaving a job. It's so funny to sort of play that out. Journalists are so funny, man.
Scott, before we leave federal politics for this episode, there is actually a consequential issue that is being debated this week.
No, what? Really?
Kind of backdrop of Hanson stunts, yeah, believe it or not. And it relates to the environment. I wanted to discuss it briefly because it actually speaks to a few things that we've talked on the show over the last couple of months, and particularly goes to the state of pretty poor political coverage at the moment, how Labor is controlling the total narrative of politics in Canberra, and I think the lack of direction the Greens seem to be experiencing right now. Before the federal election this year, Scott, the Environment Minister was Tanya Plibersek, and she'd been working on this update to Australia's federal environmental laws, which are largely seen by everyone as outdated. They don't really take into account climate change, which is obviously a very big deal when it comes to the environment. and they're not seen as being anywhere near substantive enough to actually stop new fossil fuel projects in Australia. Plibersek's attempts to change the laws, she was calling them nature positive laws, try to make them more pro-environment, were cut off by the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. And that came after a backlash from the mining industry, who hated the laws, and from the WA Labor government, who are basically owned by the mining industry. The government shelved the laws before the election, and after they were re-elected, Plibersek was dumped as the Minister for the Environment, and Murray Watt was appointed. Watt has been trying to negotiate a watered-down version of Plibersek's reforms over the past few months. And interestingly, they've stopped calling it nature positive because I think they realize that this is like now more of a stop to the business lobby and the mining lobby.
Yeah, we're neutral. We're neutral. We're neither negative nor positive on the environment. It's a neutral.
Environment neutral laws that we're trying to pass. And to kind of underscore that, he's simultaneously trying to negotiate with the coalition, who want the bill to be like more pro-business, and the Greens, who want the bill to be more pro-environment. And that kind of seemingly contradictory approach raises a pretty big question as to what exactly is the purpose of this bill? Like, what is Labor trying to do? Normally, you're like, we want to make the healthcare system better, so we will negotiate with people who also want to make the healthcare system better. That's kind of not what's going on here. This was brought up actually by the ABC's political correspondent Tom Crowley on Insiders last week. He made the point, what exactly are the Labor Party trying to do if they're trying to negotiate in both directions? Are they trying to improve the environment or create more business-friendly regulation? And that pretty fundamental question isn't really being answered by Labor. It's also not really being addressed by a lot of political reporters who are swept up in the day-to-day mechanics of the negotiations themselves. I think what it reveals in terms of Labor is their approach to basically everything at the moment is just like, how do we tick this off? How do we say we've done something and just bank on the fact that most people don't pay attention to the details? The media just loves seeing legislation be passed. We can be called a great reforming government, even though what we've passed is perhaps neutral, as you said, or maybe like worse for the environment. But that doesn't really seem to be the focus, is to get things done that are good, just to get things done. And to be honest, Scott, they probably will get away with it. Like the opposition are a total shambles right now. So what is the impetus for Labor to actually lift their game and deliver? That, to me, is where the Greens kind of come into this, because obviously they have a reputation on the environment, and you'd expect that, you know, this is an opportunity for the Greens to perhaps push Labor in a good direction. It does look like the government is trying to throw the Greens a few things to try to get their support on this bill. They seem to be pursuing that negotiation a bit more seriously than the negotiations with the coalition. But it also seems pretty obvious that the government's not going to give the Greens the kind of fundamental things that they've been asking for the past year. Things like ending native forest logging and actually making it substantively harder to open new coal and gas mines. And honestly, to me, that should be what this entire debate is about. Like, climate change is the big thing that is not just coming, it is already going to kill us, and it is already killing lots of people and harming lots of communities. Everything else is a bit of a sideshow. The Greens are coming under a lot of pressure from Labor and from the press gallery to vote for these environmental reforms. It's kind of like a bit of a rehash of what we've discussed in terms of the last federal election, where the Greens, ended up voting for climate and housing bills because they were worried they were going to be seen as blockers and they don't want to be accused of that. To go back to our friend Tom McElroy, The Guardian's political editor, he wrote about this recently, and it's an example of, I think, the pressure the Greens are under. He says that sitting out a deal could marginalize the Greens and give Labor fresh ammunition to argue that the party of the environment has sought to stand in the way of environmental protections. Now, obviously, that implies that this is like a good bill that will protect the environment and the Greens should pass it. But funnily enough, earlier in McElroy's piece, he says, environmental campaigners warn this legislation risks making the failings of the current Howard-era environment laws worse. So what's going on there? And this is kind of why I wanted to talk about this, because it sums up the disconnect between the realities of this bill and the politics as they're being mediated by journalists, right? The bill might actually be a backward step, but you have the Guardian's political editor saying the Greens should probably vote for it anyway, just in case they get accused of standing in the way of environmental protection. And sure, I guess Labor will accuse them of that because it's in Labor's interest to try to get their laws passed, even if they suck. But isn't it the job of the media, like a political editor at The Guardian, to actually help us understand what the truth is here, not just say what they're going to get accused of?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge problem with political reporting in general. I think there's obviously space to cover the power broking of it, and that those things are important to cover. The problem is that that's often all we get, that that's the only angle covered. And the reason for that is, there's less specialist reporters, there's less time, there's more deadlines, and it's easier to cover that because it's hard to be a specialist in every issue Parliament deals with. It's easy to be a specialist in the political positioning. That is easy to do. And bosses are sort of happier and happier these days to just put the horse race political coverage at the top of the page, call it a day. We don't necessarily need any more on that. And it means that that kind of thing, I think, is becoming more present. The problem is when it is all we get, and largely it is becoming all that we get.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of like the bill itself, the government really wants to try to pass this week before Parliament rises for summer. It's not really clear what the rush is. Like, they shelved it before the election. They have waited for like nearly a year, so they could wait longer, but they really want it to pass. They're piling a lot of pressure on the Greens to try to pass it. Murray Watt, the Environment Minister, held a press conference, I think, last week in the one remaining lower house seat the Greens hold in Brisbane, being like, we took all your seats last time for being blockers. You should do it again. And it'll be interesting to see what the Greens are doing. I think quite revealing about where they are at this moment in politics. My kind of take on it is, and this has been my thesis, you and I have talked about this on the show for a little while, as to like where the Greens need to go, what they need to do more of. Like, Labor needs to be held accountable now more than ever. Like, the coalition and the media are not doing it. I don't understand why the Greens would vote for what environment groups think is pretty bad legislation, give Labor this win at a time that suits them, take environment, a key issue for the Greens, off the agenda the way that they did with climate and housing last time. I think this will end up being a pretty important test for how the Greens operate under this term of Labor, and just how scared, I guess, they are of both Labor's dominance of the narrative and the media pressuring them to just kind of cave on these things. I think, and I'm saying this because I think, like, whether it's housing, climate, education, healthcare, we need to put pressure on what I think is the weakest Labor government in Australian history to actually get something done on these very important issues for this country. The coalition's not going to do it. The media's not going to do it. If the Greens don't do it, it's like, well, who else is, right? So they end up cutting some kind of deal on this. To me, that will like kind of reveal that they're terrified of Labor. They're really captured by all the Canberra bullshit, and they're too scared to stand up to the government because they're worried about what a political journalist might write about them in an editorial or an opinion piece. I just feel like that's the opposite of what the country, from a progressive perspective, needs right now. And I don't know whether they'll end up doing a deal. By the time this episode comes out, they might have, or they might have killed it. But I think this ends up being a pretty interesting litmus test for how the party operates for the next couple of years.
Be interesting to watch.
Be very interesting to watch. All right, after the break, the Sydney Morning Herald launches a campaign against an evil war machine. But it's not the one that probably first comes to mind. Scott, the Russia-Ukraine war has been going on for 10 years now. It's been more than 3 years since Russia actually invaded Ukraine, but we may be getting closer to peace. Earlier this week, a 28-point plan for peace proposed by the US was leaked. It was criticized for handing Russia a number of key things Putin's been fighting for, including Ukrainian territory that Russia has conquered and commitments for Ukraine to remain out of NATO and limit the size of its defense force. But there are now negotiations underway. Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, says he's pushing back against some of those points. It's still pretty early in the negotiations, but it does seem like we're getting closer to an end game here. And honestly, that was pretty likely following Trump's election, where he made it clear that he didn't really see it as the US's role to provide Ukraine with kind of the endless weapons and military support and intelligence that they need to continue the conflict and have any chance of beating Russia. This is also relevant to Australia as well, because we are helping arm Ukraine. Like, we've sent Ukraine enormous amounts of military hardware. We've also sent military advisors there as well. We are well and truly involved in this war, and how it plays out is going to impact us too.
Yeah, our Bushmasters are driving around over there. To me, Ukraine is such a tricky story. I remember when Russia tried to invade 3 years ago. I was still at the ABC and got pulled onto 4 a.m. shifts to help write the breaking coverage. On the one hand, with this story, I think there are horrific things still going on, every week. Indiscriminate shelling of civilian areas, massacres those kind of things. And I think it's sadly, because so much news has gone on in the world in the last 3 years, it's easy to lose sight of that or discount it compared to other horrors. And I feel like that is quite unfortunate that it's fallen into that. On the other hand, I've always been very uncomfortable with journalists ever cheerleading in a war. And it's always struck me as a bit distasteful and dangerous that with the Ukraine story in particular, there are some journalists who've kind of taken it upon themselves to appoint themselves as sort of advocates for a certain side, for sending arms, when I think in war, journalists should really scrutinize everyone who has a gun in their hands. But I say that to just set up the Ukraine, Russia, Australia, Trump, Nexus. It's all a fascinating minefield, Oz. Like, let's get into it.
Yeah, and the Australia nexus is interesting because it brings me to some pretty interesting local coverage of aspects of the war over the past couple of weeks. For the past 10 days, the Sydney Morning Herald has been running this series called Blood Oil. It's been led by the European correspondent, David Crowe, and it highlights the economic and military links between Australia and Russia, particularly the fact that Russian oil is being sold in Australia in what appears to be a breach of international sanctions. Interestingly, a lot of what was in the initial story on blood oil is actually reported by SBS in October, and it's the work of this European think tank that's looking at how Russia is using Indian kind of holding ports and kind of Indian refineries to move its oil throughout the rest of the world. The SMH stories have taken it a lot further. The reporting's pretty interesting. It essentially accuses Australia of helping fund Russia's bombing of Ukraine through our purchasing of Russian oil. And one story they published even breaks down the estimated $1 billion of Russian oil sales in Australia and turns them into weapons the Russian government has been able to buy to fund its war. You know, it says that that would buy Russia 4 Sukhoi fighter jets to kind of bomb Ukraine from the air, 10 tanks, 45 missiles, 700 AK-74 rifles, and 1,000 shells. It's pretty compelling reporting, and the paper really got behind it. The SMH editor, Bevan Shields, who, as you mentioned at the top, resigned on Tuesday, unrelated to this. It just happens to be the week that we're talking about it. And we're going to cover more of that in our Keeping Tabs segment. He published a video on how important this series is. The video had the subheading, "Loopholes are allowing Australia to help fund Vladimir Putin's evil war machine."
Where it's refined and then sent on ships to Australia, and it ends up in petrol stations right around the country. What this has meant is that while Australia has given quite a lot of money in aid to Ukraine, we've sent a whole lot more back in oil revenue to Moscow to fund this war. We think that's wrong. We think it's counterproductive. And that's why we're running this campaign to urge the government to act and put a stop to it. So this issue isn't a new one. It's been rumbling on for quite a while, but there is a moment right now where a lot of countries are acting to stop this backdoor trade.
And he's also published multiple editorials calling on the government to act. And look, Scott, it's pretty worthy stuff. It's an interesting story, and I think a lot of Australians will, you know, sit up in their chairs at the idea that when they fill up their car at the petrol station, they could be funding shells and bombs attacking Ukrainian civilians. But I can't help but think of an obvious comparison here. Can you remember, Scott, the Sydney Morning Herald calling Israel an evil war machine, or running a campaign on trying to stop the funding of that war machine, or imploring our government to crack down on our economic and military ties, even though Israel is committing a genocide, which is illegal under international law? Any memory of these things occurring?
No, of course not, Oz. No memory. No, it's never occurred. I know we're going to talk a bit about the Gaza comparison with Ukraine in a minute, but just before we do, I sort of said before that I've been a bit uncomfortable with some of the journalism that has happened around the Ukraine conflict. And I do think that even on its own merits, separate from Gaza, there are some strange, weird ethical issues going on. Now, this reporting I actually found pretty fascinating, and I think is actually fine and good and have no issue with it. But it does exist in a history of journalism that has kind of stepped the line during this conflict. The most ethically questionable story to me has always been from the very beginning the coverage of foreigners going to fight in Ukraine. We still see that today, these glorified heroic portrayals of Australians, Brits, Americans who go to fight over there. The ABC's 7:30 did a story like this year. Seven have done one as recently as this year. I have huge problems with that I just thought I'd mention, not because I have any real politics on the conflict, but I think treating these guys like celebrities encourages other people to go. You're saying, if you go, we'll give you the hero treatment. And people may be like induced to go and fight. And people in war, like, who knows what happens to people who take this up and go. We've already seen a bunch of foreign fighters come back with PTSD, saying the conflict wasn't what they thought it was. Like, you might have people go and actually commit some pretty unsavory acts. War on all sides can be awful, and like commanding officers could put them in really bad situations. I just mention this, Oz, because I think there are real ethical dangers in the Ukraine story, even before we get to the comparison with Gaza. This story doesn't fall afoul of them, but I just think the whole conflict actually raises a bunch of questions that haven't been discussed among journalists or scrutinized.
It's a good point, and I think it does speak to another example of the double standard in terms of who in the past 2 years has been valorized and you know, made, as you say, to look like a hero for their participation in a particular war, and who has been demonized and criminalized for expressing support for a particular side in a different war. And that kind of brings me back to the Blood Oil series. Like, what stood out to me here, and it does manifest in this examples you're talking about as well, is kind of how unequivocal the journalists and the outlets are on this. They're not even attempting to run a both sides argument. It's complicated. They're not trying to say, look, we accuse Putin of this. This is what Putin says about Ukraine. This is a complicated story. Here are the two sides. Make up your mind. It's so unequivocal. Russia is an evil regime committing war crimes, and it is incumbent upon us as journalists, us as the Australian, and us as the Australian government to do everything we can to stop them. Now, fine, good. It's useful to have a moral compass every now and then and say that war and murder and violence and the killing of civilians is bad. But it is so jarring after being told for the last 2 years that Israel's bombing of Gaza is complicated. There are multiple sides. We can't use emotive language. We can't say evil. We have to be very careful before we accuse anyone of war crimes. We've got to put the defenses of the Israeli government and of Netanyahu and the Israeli Defense Force in as many stories as possible. We need to lead with them most of the time. Everyone's different opinion needs to be reflected. If you're a journalist who thinks that one side is bad, then you should stop being a journalist. If you sign a letter saying that there needs to be more responsible journalism that scrutinizes the lies of the Israeli government, you will get suspended from working on stories about the war. That's what we've been told has to happen for you to be considered a, quote, good journalist in Australia. But when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, seemingly none of those principles apply. And that's just kind of like the very top line stuff about how journalists are supposed to engage with a war. But specifically on this question of how Australia is directly involved in various war machines, I don't doubt at all what the SMH is publishing in terms of what Russian oil and buying that is allowing Putin to do. But when activists and campaigners were trying to argue that Australia was also directly involved in Israel's genocide through deals with Israeli weapons companies and through our manufacturing of F-35 fighter jets that Israel uses to bomb Gaza, outlets like the Sydney Morning Herald dismissed it, and they dismissed it pretty arrogantly and patronizingly. In fact, David Crowe himself, who has led the Blood Oil series, wrote back in May this year, "The Greens spent much of the last term campaigning furiously on the war in Gaza. It was personal. Bant claimed in Parliament that Albanese and Dutton were complicit in genocide. This was hyperbolic and offensive." So that's a journalist saying it's offensive to say that Albanese, who refused to ban arms sales to Israel, and Dutton, who wanted to align Australia even more closely to Israel, were complicit in genocide. But how do you align that with a series of stories that basically says everyone who drives a car in Australia is complicit in murdering Ukrainian civilians because buying that oil is funding the missiles used to target specific apartments and kill specific children and innocent women? I just can't understand how those two things can be held true at the same time by the same people.
Totally, yeah. The bow is so much long. It's an important bow to draw, but so much longer in the Russia case. We're not literally sending them arms. We're not literally sharing intelligence. We're not all these things versus in the Israel comparison. The SMH and The Age in particular, I'd say, Oz, out of all the media outlets, have bent over backwards to say any connection to Israel are being invented by the pro-Palestine movement and the Greens, that the government has no responsibility, create maximum distance between Australia and Israel's military. Last year, Matthew Knott, who wrote a few of the stories in the Blood Oil piece, wrote a piece kind of claiming to explain where Israel gets its weapons and whether Australia was involved in any of that. And in the piece, Knott completely ran the government line that none of the exports to Israel are lethal in any way, which is, so people know, is a ridiculous bit of lawyering the government has used to say that our arms exports are somehow items with dual uses. They can be used both by the military and civilians, so don't worry about it. These aren't weapons. And he quoted a senior Defense Department official giving an example. That official said, quote, "A pencil is used for writing. It's not designed in and of itself to be a weapon, but it can, if you want, to use it as a weapon." We're not exporting pencils to Israel, Oz. Like, what? Like, we're exporting bomb bay doors for F-35 fighter jets, visors the pilots wear that display targeting information before they fire a missile into a building. It's patently ridiculous. And obviously, you have to quote it. I'm not saying that quote comes from Matthew Knott's mouth, but to not interrogate how ridiculous that comparison is, just to go, yes, yeah. Oh, I mean, that explains it from the Defense Department's perspective, and not scrutinize it. Like, what? So just waving that line through has meant that the work of scrutinizing that has been down to independent media, to activists, to like one or two articles at the ABC that have been fantastic, but like the biggest newspapers in the country have abdicated scrutinizing that at all. And this Blood Oil series after that is rich.
Yeah, it's rich. And it does make their attacks on people for trying to point out Australia's complicity in what Israel is doing look pretty shameless. And for the last 2 years, we have had this real-time case study of just how journalists, when they want, can be unequivocal in saying this particular government is led by a crazy man doing terrible, violent things. And then you contrast to that how they speak about Israel. It's just been so like stark to see it. And I think this series has really brought it home for me. The obvious question, Scott, is like, why is there this difference? You know, and I think what it confirms is this is not about like journalistic principles and how to do journalism. It's not about being just an independent, unbiased journalist that we've been told is the important thing for the last 2 years. You know, I was told in newsrooms, you can't have an opinion if you think that this government is bad or this war is bad. I'm sorry, you can't do journalism on it. Now the Sydney Morning Herald is running, by the words of their own editor, a literal campaign targeting a government for committing war crimes. If you can do that in the case of Russia, what is your argument to attack and demonize and essentially bully and force out of newsrooms around the country journalists who didn't even want to run a campaign targeting Israel, who were just saying, let's report on this accurately and not defer to the Israeli government? And, you know, yeah, obviously the question is why. I mean, to me, it's pretty clear. Like, it's about the fact that Russia is much easier to write about honestly because there is no organized long-term lobbying effort that dominates our media and politics that everyone is afraid of, unlike with Israel. That's it. It's about power and fear. It is not about journalistic ethics. It's not about the lectures that we've been had. And this has come from the most senior like figures in Australian media, Scott, who said this is how journalism should work, the ones who've dictated how coverage of Gaza should flow. But honestly, there's also been a lot of journalists of our generation, you know, mid-career journalists, people who are reporting, who echo this line as well and say, oh, look, I get it. But, you know, being a journalist means you sometimes have to leave your opinions at the door and just report on stuff independently. How do they square that with what the SMH is doing on this stuff? If you're happy to go into a newsroom that says Vladimir Putin is an evil warmonger and we need to do everything we can to stop funding his regime, if you're happy to say that's a principle you can adopt as a journalist, why does that principle not apply to Israel? It obviously does. And it's not about ethics. It's not about how to play the rules. It's just because you're not scared of Russia and you're terrified about not getting a promotion because of the fact you're scared of saying Israel is also an evil warmongering regime. That to me is really all this is about. And thank you to the SMH for laying it out so starkly for all of us to see.
Hear, hear. Well said.
All right, after the break, the Sydney Morning Herald loses its editor. The NRL commentator turned right-wing pro-Israel commentator. Erin Molan's funding sources revealed. And if I haven't lost my mind enough already, I lose it again about the state of sports media in Australia.
Oz, we mentioned the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald in the last segment, Bevan Shields. Well, this week he resigned. I found this fascinating to see how this story broke. It sort of entered mainstream news. It was at one point a top 3 story on news.com, which is usually more reality TV stars than newspaper editors. Bevan found himself in some fine company. And I think like it breaking through and becoming a story has a lot to do with Shields and his kind of unique public persona. I think particularly on Twitter back in the days before Elon Musk and X.com, you know, there were a lot of people who mocked him and he became a bit of a punchline on that website. To Bevan something was kind of to misunderstand an issue or draw a kind of long centrist bow on a complicated topic. The most famous incident was probably the leaked internal Slack messages that were published on that platform, where a reporter covering an industrial dispute on Sydney's rail network said in the Slack that it wasn't technically a strike. And he promptly told the reporter it was and to publish it. And it led to kind of a minor scandal at the time. I've never met Shields, but I know a lot of smart, good journalists I respect who've worked with him who really like him. And I don't know the answer to this, but it's always sort of fascinated me, the gap between how some in the public see him and how his colleagues see him. That's always interested me as a figure. I think the other thing about his departure, Oz, is it could be a real milestone for the Nine newspapers. He's been one of the only senior editors who came through the old Fairfax newspapers all the way through his career. Since the merger, Nine has installed a lot of ex-News Corp, ex-Daily Mail, ex-Fox Sports editors and senior managers to run the papers. And, you know, while his replacement, Jordan Baker, is also a Fairfax alum, I think his departure still kind of marks potentially a moment in the company. What do we think of Shields going? What does the end of the Bevan era mean, Oz?
Yeah, interesting on this idea of his public reputation versus his internal reputation. As you said, I think a lot of it had to do with how prominent and vocal he was on Twitter during like its heyday when, you know, a lot of journalists were there. But, you know, who among us hasn't experienced this issue? You know, you post a lot. Sometimes you post some dumb things and 10 years later, people post screenshots of it that go viral from time to time. Who can relate? Certainly not me.
No,
Work
of course.
I did work with Bevan for a few years when I was at the Herald and the Age. He was pretty well liked within the papers. He was seen as a real advocate for the paper and for its journalism, particularly the kind of journalism, as you mentioned, that has been identified with the Fairfax stables, like really strong state politics reporting, state education reporting, and a lot of interest in politics, where he was, you know, the federal politics editor for a while. And I think a lot of that was respected and appreciated by journalists at the paper because it was happening at a time where Nine was swallowing up more and more and, like, you know, making its mark on the papers. There's been whispers of him leaving for a while. And interestingly, Scott, like in terms of what this might mean for the future of the paper, I think it's worth like looking at how this news broke. Like the day before Bevan announced his resignation, there was a story in the Australian newspaper, which is obviously like a rival to the Nine papers. And that paper was saying, hey, Bevan's going to go pretty soon. Here's like 5 strikes that he's committed, or like 5 things that he's done that are pretty bad that mean that it's time for him to go. 9 people are talking about him leaving, and his replacement is going to be Jordan Baker, right? That gets leaked to the Australian the day before Bevan leaves. And let me put it this way. It's not Bevan who leaks to the Australian that he's on his way out after committing. That is obviously someone at Nine backgrounding their competitor that the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald is about to leave. And I have no further insight into that or any particular dynamics that might be there, but it's always interesting when someone senior at the company is backgrounding this stuff and it ends up happening. It does suggest perhaps there is some tension, that there is, a little bit of nine power plays or maneuvering going on. You and I have discussed this before. I think one of the most disgraceful things management do at media companies is leak about their own staff to opposing outlets.
Yeah.
And
it
I
is the
think,
executives. The journos are not leaking to the Australian. The Australian is the newspaper of media executives. That's who is reading it, and that's who's giving them a phone call.
Yeah, exactly. And in terms of what happens next, you mentioned that Jordan Baker, she's also been at the Fairfax Post for a long time, will step in as the editor of the paper. But one thing I thought I'd just kind of share in terms of what these roles are like now, and this is partly to do with the Nine takeover. It's partly also just to do with, the way the newspapers, the Herald and the Age, have transformed over the years in an era of budget cuts. The actual editors of the paper, so Bevan in Sydney and Patrick Elligott at the Age, their kind of role and what they control is quite different to, say, what it was like 10, 15 years ago, where the editor of the paper was the boss of everything. They kind of decided everything, and they ran everything from federal politics to international affairs to local crime. Now the way those papers work is a lot of the big stuff, federal politics, business, global coverage, is run by a separate position called the national editor.
That's interesting.
The sports stuff is also kind of run separately by a national sports editor. There is the executive editor, Luke McElveen, who's the former Daily Mail editor we've talked about a couple of times, who sits above both of those and makes the big calls, like on what big contentious stories get published. The state editors, or the paper editors, still obviously have power. They've got local teams, but they really focus more on like running the state coverage, state politics, state health, crime, and deciding what's on the front page of the papers. So, I think like it's significant and it matters, but I think in a lot of instances, a lot of the decisions being made that drive the coverage of the Nine papers now are being made by people like Luke McElveen, who don't have the public profile of Bevan or Patrick, but actually do wield a lot of influence in terms of the direction of where those papers go.
That's fascinating. Oz, the other thing I wanted to keep tabs on is that in an early episode of this show, I talked about an iconic Australian broadcaster who made the leap into independent media. No, I'm not talking about you. I'm not even talking about Antoinette Lattouf or Jan Fran. I'm talking about former rugby league commentator and breakfast radio host, Erin Molan. At the time, she'd just been let go by Sky News after a brief run at trying to be a right-wing commentator, and she'd started up a independent, very, very, very pro-Israel show where she gets super worked up and distraught about how much Israel needs our support. Here's an example from just this week.
Bigger battle that threatens all of us and is already rearing its ugly head in countries far, far away from the Middle East. Again, let me be clear. If you care about babies in Gaza, and you should, then support the efforts to eliminate the terrorists who hand them a death sentence at birth. And mic drop, for those again at the back who need it a little bit louder, that ain't Israel or the Jews. It's the Islamic extremists who care only about destruction of everything we in the West hold dear, that those kids deserve. Life.
And since we first talked about her, Oz, it's been onwards and upwards for Molan. 2 weeks ago, Benjamin Netanyahu himself, the Prime Minister of Israel, sat down with Molan for half an hour in an exclusive interview. Wow, Oz, you'd think Netanyahu might have a bit on. Pretty big get for a little YouTube, Twitter video show to get the Prime Minister of Israel exclusively. Why would Netanyahu see Erin Molan as important enough to sit down with exclusively? Well, thanks to some reporting by the American Conservative a couple of weeks ago, a right-wing magazine, we know why the Israeli Prime Minister might be so invested in Molan. Molan's show is published in association with a company called Salem Media Network, which is an evangelical Christian media group, and it's got massively into the political podcasting space. They host The Charlie Kirk Show, The Right View with Lara Trump, and Molan. Well, quite the stable. In September, Oz, new filings with the US federal government show that the Israeli government agreed to a $6 million retainer with Salem Media's chief strategy officer to advocate for Israeli interests. The contract explicitly promises, quote, integration of narrative messaging into Salem Media Network properties and aligned distribution channels. Such is this contract, Oz, that it means that Salem Media's chief strategy officer had to register as a foreign agent for Israel. So a senior executive at the company that Molan publishes with is literally a paid foreign agent in the US for Israel. Stunning developments for our girl.
Yeah, so much is coming to light about just how much money Israel was spending on trying to win the propaganda war on social media. Netanyahu had this meeting with influencers in New York a few months ago where he talked about social media being the most important battlefield in Israel's effort to influence the global public. And in that media conversation, TikTok came up. And to kind of end the conversation where we started it about Larry Ellison, let's not forget that he is part of the consortium that is trying to buy TikTok, or has bought TikTok. And he is very close to Benjamin Netanyahu. So this Molan thing is like one drop in an ocean of how much money and time and energy pro-Israel figures and the Israeli government are using to dominate the conversation online. It's an incredible, incredible case study of what they're doing to win the so-called propaganda war.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And look, independent media is not exactly flush with money. I think we can both assure our listeners, please subscribe.
But I have like 3 T-shirts I wear again and again. Come on, guys, help us out here.
But I think it's fascinating to, we don't have all of the answers yet, but you look at so many of the kind of quote unquote independent media on the right. These talent do not come cheap. There are high production values at work. This is like one part of the picture. It's going to be really interesting to follow these people because I don't think they are, grinding and slumming it like some of us are out here.
Yeah, it's not fair, man. The right get like Israel and Peter Thiel to bankroll them, and they call themselves independent media, but they're bankrolled by these absolute freaks. Well, yeah, we don't have any of these freaks. Where's fucking George Soros, man? Keep hearing about this guy funding the left. We've not gotten any calls from George Soros.
No, nothing. Sunrise, any of that. Yeah. Give us a couple of bill, George.
Scott, on Monday, we talked a little bit about the cricket and particularly the controversy around Usman Khawaja. And sadly, I was wrong. Despite the fact that Australia won the first match of the series, there has still been a steady stream of stories on Khawaja, the controversy around the round of golf he played, and numerous calls from sections of the Australian sports media for him to be dropped as a batsman for the rest of this series. Khawaja, funnily enough, seemed to enjoy trolling the media about this. He added a photo of a golf course to his photo dump on Instagram after the Perth game. And like, why am I talking about this on a podcast about media and politics rather than one really about sport? I mean, obviously to me, Scott, the focus on Khawaja is about more than just cricket. And I think that is from Australian fans as well as sections of the media. So much of the social media commentary says that he's been too focused on Gaza. Like we've discussed, Khawaja being one of the very few Australian athletes who's been very vocal on the genocide in Gaza. He's also dealt with his entire career a constant level of racism, right? And he's talked about this. It's always been an undercurrent with Uzi. He's had to deal with that as a Pakistani Muslim growing up in Australia. He's had to deal with that within the cricketing establishment. He's had to deal with that in the sports media as well. And I think that's important and interesting and relevant for people to know because it doesn't magically disappear when it comes to these conversations about who is the best batsman to be playing for Australia at this particular point in time. And we talked about the political media and their inability to talk about race properly. I think the sports media has all of those problems. One of the interesting things about the Ashes being on and a big Australian cricket series being on is if you're on Instagram or on any kind of social media platform, you see the commentary teams from the ABC, from SEN, from 9, from 7, all post selfies together. And like, you will struggle to find a non-white Australian who is part of any of those things. So we're talking about a guy who has got a history of being written about in a very racialized way and an Australian sports media ecosystem that doesn't really know how to handle that.
There's
So that's
more
like, I
diversity
think,
in
the
the traveling
context here.
English commentators, by the way, than the Australian
seriously.
commentators, which is like, that's embarrassing. Like when the English have more diverse broadcasters than we do. Bad.
I mean, I think it's interesting that, like, yeah, on Australian TV, you'll see Ishigua, who is, English, not Australian, and Bharat Sundaresan, who is an Australian. I'm not trying to, like, diminish Bharat's, Australian-ness. He's obviously part of Australian story and had a great episode about him becoming an Australian citizen. But important to understand that Bharat's rise in the sports media didn't happen in Australia. he had his success internationally and has since come to Australia. I think that's an important thing for people to understand in terms of just like how hard it has been for non-white people to break through the Australian sports media. So where does that leave us with like Khawaja? Like, firstly, I think it's pretty clear that the relentless focus on him and this round of golf is driven by like a deep antipathy to him that is about much more than the fact that he played golf. And these calls for him, like, to be really clear, he had a back injury which ruled him out of the first innings of the first test, and because Australia won, he didn't get a chance to play. And now there are calls for him to be dropped from the series entirely. That just doesn't stack up to me, and it's why I think there is like so much more to this and the antipathy towards him from sections of the Australian public and from the media. Because in the lead up to the series, Scott, so we're going really deep on cricket stuff now. This is a bit indulgent, but if you've made it this far into the podcast, I imagine you're here for it. In the lead up to this series, the question was, who is Australia going to get to open with Khawaja? Because he was our only reliable opening batsman. Constance wasn't working out. Labuschagne wasn't working out. Now all of a sudden, Uzi can't play one innings because he's injured. It's like, well, he's got to go. He's obviously got to go. The Australian batting lineup is so good without him. Why are we even hanging around with him? And if you look at the stats, Scott, it just doesn't hold up. There have been nearly 90 opening batsmen in the history of Australian Test cricket. Uzi is number 8 in terms of who has scored the most runs. And that includes the fact that he was dropped from the team for a significant chunk of time in the mid-2010s. He's one of the top 10 Australian batsmen ever. And we're saying because he missed one innings and because of this insane media controversy over this round of golf, he should just be dropped and like not given a chance to play the rest of this series. It is ridiculous to me. And part of the reason why I'm talking about it on the show is because I've been really frustrated at how little this conversation is being had in the mainstream sports media. And I will just point out that it was Bharat, who's one of the very few people I've seen push back on this golf narrative on Offsiders on the ABC on Sunday. And I think it's not a coincidence that it's generally speaking non-white people who care about cricket who point out the double standards applied to Khawaja in this instance and in all instances.
You ready? You got to hear out the first 2 sentences I say before you just jump in like a madman, okay?
Oh God, here we go. All right.
No, I think real quick, I think there's, sports coverage has to cover when players might be struggling for form. And look, there is a fair way to cover that Usman has had a difficult, last probably year of Test cricket. But the thing is that I would ask everyone in the sports media, if any of them are listening, is, he's about to turn 39. He's coming towards the end of his career. He has been, the best Test player in the world. He's won that. He has been one of the greatest batsmen of the last 10 years for any country. Can you imagine any of the Australian greats being treated like this in their kind of twilight years of their career? They would all, you think of a Steve Waugh, a Ricky Ponting, in their sort of final potentially seasons of their career, would they be hounded like this? And so there is, of course, space for criticism, but if you can't see the double standard that's going on here, like the unanimity with which these people speak, the fact that it's about things like outside of cricket, that they're extending it to his like personal views, his hobbies, all of this stuff, there is no way that anyone would question Ricky Ponting and his interest in greyhounds or Matty Hayden fishing too much or whatever towards the end of his career. There's like clearly a component to this that is not kind of fair coverage about a player.
No, well put. I think, the point is not, I don't think that he should just be selected indefinitely for as long as he wants. There's always challenges, but having grown up and seeing the respect and reverence that was doled out to the greats of Australian cricket, seeing none of that apply to Khawaja, who has been one of the greatest Australian players for a long time now. And was ICC World Test player like 2 or 3 years ago, not that long ago.
And part of the reason that they're afforded that respect is because they're so good. Like, older players who may like struggle for form, any Test, they are so good. They could pull out an incredible innings. Like, there is a reason they're afforded that respect because they're greats of the game. And, you have no idea if next Test is the one, and they're given that.
Yeah, I mean, I hope he does get selected, and I hope he hits a ton at the Gabba just to shut everyone up. Speaking of shutting up, that is it from us on this mega episode. If you enjoyed the show, we'd love it if you left us a review or shared it with a friend. You can email us questions or tips at contact@lamestream.com.au. Remember, you can subscribe to support our work and get ad-free versions of the show now at lamestream.com.au. Thank you to our producer Bez, our video producer Schwen. Scott, see you back here on Monday.
See you Monday, Oz.